The morning she left her mother's house for the last time, she was 22 years old and had never spent a night alone with a man. Not once, not even close. Every conversation she had ever held with an eligible gentleman had been conducted within earshot of a chaperone. Every walk she had ever taken had been watched. Every letter she had ever written had been reviewed. And now, in the space of a single morning, all of that was over. She was a wife, and in a matter of hours, she would be on a train headed for the English coast, sitting beside a man she had known for 11 weeks, about to begin the most anticipated and least understood journey of her entire life. This is the story of a Victorian aristocratic honeymoon, and if you think it sounds romantic, you are partly right. But if you think you already know what it looked like, what it felt like, and what it actually meant for the woman at the center of it, then I promise you, you are missing the most extraordinary parts. Let us begin where she began, not on the train, not in Paris, but in the weeks before the wedding, when the shape of her future was being assembled around her like a very beautiful cage. She was the daughter of a baron, not fabulously wealthy, but comfortably established. Her family owned a country estate in the south of England, employed 17 indoor servants, and maintained a townhouse in London for the season. She had been educated at home by a governess, then briefly at a finishing school, where she had studied French, watercolors, deportment, and the piano. She read novels in secret and history in public. She was considered accomplished. She was considered charming. She was considered, above all, marriageable. The entire architecture of her education had been building toward a single outcome, not a career, not an intellectual life, not independence, marriage, specifically the right marriage. A marriage that would consolidate her family's position, relieve the financial pressures quietly accumulating in the background, and secure her own future in a world that offered women of her class almost no alternative safety net. If she did not marry well, the consequences were not simply social embarrassment. They were economic vulnerability that could last a lifetime. And so she had been presented at court. She had done the season. She had attended the balls and the dinners and the afternoon calls and the garden parties and the opera evenings and the country house weekends. She had worn the right dresses and said the right things and smiled at the right moments. She had been watched and evaluated and discussed by people she would never meet. And then, one afternoon in late spring, a gentleman had called on her father. His name was the kind of name that filled rooms before he entered them. He was the son of an earl. He was 29 years old. He was not especially handsome, but he was tall, and he had a steadiness about him that her mother described as character and her father described as suitable. He had an income of £6,000 a year. He had estates. He had prospects. He had also, by Victorian standards, made a rather swift courtship. They had been introduced at a ball in March. By May, he had asked her father's permission to propose. By June, they were engaged. By September, they would be married. 11 weeks. That was the sum total of the time she had to know the man she would share the rest of her life with. And during those 11 weeks, they had never once been alone. Think about that for a moment. 11 weeks of carefully supervised conversation. 11 weeks of short walks with a maid trailing 10 feet behind. 11 weeks of calling cards and morning visits and dinner parties where they sat at opposite ends of the table and could only exchange glances. The most intimate contact they had experienced was when he had helped her into a carriage and his hand had briefly touched hers. She had thought about that touch for 3 days afterward. Not because she was naive, because she was 22 years old and she had never been allowed to feel anything else. What did she actually know about him? She knew his name, she knew his title, she knew his family connections and his approximate income. She knew that he had attended Eton and then Oxford. She knew that he was considered a good shot and a capable horseman. She knew that he was not much of a dancer, but that he laughed at the right moments during conversation. She knew that he wore good boots and that his cravat was always impeccably tied. And she knew that he had looked at her, really looked at her, twice. Once at a garden party in May, when she had said something slightly irreverent about a painting they were both examining, and once at a dinner in July, when she had corrected a small but confident historical error made by his father, and he had watched her do it with something in his eyes that felt, to her, like genuine interest. That was what she had to build a marriage on: 2 looks, 11 weeks, and a name. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning in September 1880 at the parish church where her family had worshipped for 3 generations. The church had been filled with white flowers. Orange blossoms, symbols of purity and fertility, had been woven into her hair beneath the veil. Her dress was cream silk with a long train and a modest neckline, and she had worn it for the first and last time on that single morning. The ceremony had been brief, measured, and deeply formal. Afterward, there had been a wedding breakfast at her family's townhouse, with speeches and cake and the kind of controlled celebration that Victorian aristocratic families excelled at producing. Everything was elegant, everything was correct. Nothing revealed how much was riding on this moment, or how many things no one was saying aloud. Late in the afternoon, the carriage arrived to take them to the station. Her mother had embraced her. Her mother had said something quiet and private in her ear, something that historians would later piece together from diaries and letters written by Victorian brides in the same position. Something that was simultaneously the most important thing anyone could have told her about the next 24 hours, and also the vaguest and most inadequate piece of advice ever delivered. What mothers said to their daughters at this moment, according to the historical record, ranged from the deeply unhelpful to the entirely mysterious. One Victorian woman wrote later in her diary that her mother had told her simply to be a good wife. Another recorded that her mother had said, "It will be uncomfortable at first, but you must endure." A third, writing decades afterward, described having arrived at her wedding night with, in her own words, ignorance as profound as a child of 4. The social activist Annie Besant put it in writing in 1866, describing her own experience. Her education, her upbringing, her sheltered life had left her knowing, as she wrote, almost nothing of what marriage actually meant. So she got into the carriage, and the carriage took her to the train, and the train took her to the coast, and the boat took her across the channel. And somewhere in the middle of the English Channel, as the white cliffs of Dover faded behind her and the first outline of the French coast appeared ahead, she crossed a threshold that had nothing to do with geography. She was no longer who she had been. She was a wife now, and everything that word meant was still, for her, a mystery she was in the process of discovering. Let us pause here and talk about what the Victorian honeymoon actually was, because the word honeymoon in 1880 meant something considerably more complicated than it does today. The romantic notion of a honeymoon as a private escape for 2 people in love was still relatively new, still being defined, still contested by the older traditions it was replacing. Before the railways had transformed travel in the middle of the 19th century, what upper-class newlyweds typically did after the wedding was something called the bridal tour. This was not a romantic getaway. It was a social obligation. The couple would travel around visiting family members and friends who had not been able to attend the wedding, introducing the bride to her new social world. The bride was, in a very real sense, being delivered to her new life. By 1880, the railway had changed everything. The railways had made the continent accessible in a way it had never been before. What had once taken weeks of uncomfortable coach travel across bad roads could now be accomplished in days on smooth iron rails in a first-class carriage with dining arrangements that contemporary travelers described as beyond comparison. The boat train from London to Dover, the channel crossing by steam packet, the train from Calais to Paris, the journey that had once been an aristocratic expedition requiring months of preparation could now be completed in under 24 hours. And so by 1880, the aristocratic honeymoon had evolved into something closer to what we would recognize today. It was a journey, a real journey. For the affluent, it was almost always a continental journey. It was the grand tour reimagined as a marital rite, a trip through the great cities and landscapes of Europe that served simultaneously as education, pleasure, social performance, and the private beginning of a shared life. The standard aristocratic honeymoon route of this era was well established. It began in London and proceeded through Dover to the Channel crossing, then Calais, then the train south and east to Paris, which was always the first and most essential stop. Paris in 1880 was at the height of its Belle Epoque reinvention. The city houseman had rebuilt into wide boulevards and grand perspectives, a city of cafes and opera houses and art galleries, and some of the finest hotels in the world. From Paris, the couple might proceed to Switzerland, through the Alps, down into Italy, Florence, Rome, Venice, the Mediterranean, a circuit of what was considered the cradle of Western civilization, the source of the arts and architecture and antiquity that educated people were supposed to know intimately. The grand tour, now undertaken as a married pair. For our young aristocrat, this journey was not simply tourism. It was her first experience of freedom, not complete freedom. She was still a wife now, which meant she was still subject to the legal and social constraints of Victorian marriage, constraints that were, by modern standards, extraordinary. Under the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, wives in England had gained some rights to keep wages they earned, but the sweeping reforms that would give married women true property rights were still 2 years away. In 1880, a woman's legal identity was still largely absorbed into her husband's. She could not sue in her own name. She could not sign contracts independently. Her property, upon marriage, belonged to him unless specific legal arrangements had been made otherwise. But in Paris, none of that was visible. In Paris, she was a titled Englishwoman in a first-class hotel suite with a husband who was still, in many ways, a stranger, in a city where the usual rules of her life did not apply. The hotel where they stayed was one of the great establishments on the right bank, the kind of place that catered to exactly this kind of visitor, where every room had heavy silk curtains and a fireplace and a writing desk, where the staff spoke at least 3 languages and could source virtually anything within hours, and where the dining room was considered one of the finest in a city, famous for its food. This was not accidental. The grand hotels of Paris had been built precisely for the British and American aristocracy and wealthy middle class who flooded the city after the railways made travel so accessible. They were designed to make English visitors feel simultaneously impressive and at home. The rooms were enormous. The beds were enormous. The silence behind the thick walls was enormous. It was in that hotel room, on the first night, that everything she had not been told caught up with her. I want to be careful and precise here, because what happened in Victorian bedrooms on wedding nights was not monolithic. It was not one experience. Historical records, diaries, letters, and the scholarly work of historians like Helena Michie in her book Victorian Honeymoons show us a full spectrum of experiences. Some brides had been quietly educated by mothers or older female relatives. Some had pieced together information from books or conversations with married friends. Some arrived with reasonable expectations. Some arrived with none at all. And some, like the woman whose voice I am borrowing here, arrived with the particular mixture of intelligence and enforced ignorance that the Victorian system produced in exactly equal measure. What the historical record makes clear is this: the expectation of ignorance was itself a cultural product. The ideology of Victorian femininity, particularly for upper and middle-class women, required the preservation of what was called female innocence, not simply chastity. Ignorance. Women were supposed to arrive at marriage knowing nothing of the physical realities of it. Dr. William Acton, writing in 1875, articulated the prevailing medical and social consensus when he wrote that many women felt no sexual excitement whatsoever, that their interests lay naturally in home, children, and domestic life. This was not simply a description, it was a prescription. It shaped how girls were educated, what they were told, and what was kept from them. And so, when the door of the hotel room closed behind her for the first time, when the sounds of Paris filtered up through the windows, and the firelight moved quietly across the ceiling, when the man she had known for 11 weeks became, suddenly and irrevocably, her husband in all the dimensions that word contained. She was navigating something for which she had been given almost no map. Some Victorian brides wrote about this night in diaries that became historical documents. The language they used was careful, oblique, encoded. Mary Sidgwick, married in 1859 at 18 to an older man, recorded later in her diary a phrase so compressed and devastating that historians have quoted it for over a century. She wrote only this regarding her arrival in Paris. "How I cried at Paris, the nights. Not all Victorian honeymoons were like this. The spectrum ran from genuine tenderness to genuine misery, and every variation between. What mattered, and what historians have observed, was the character of the husband, the degree of preparation the bride had received, and the quality of what today we might call emotional intelligence in both parties. A man who was gentle, patient, and attentive to his new wife's experience produced a radically different outcome from one who simply expected compliance." The Victorian marriage bed was, like so many Victorian institutions, a site of profound inequality that could, in individual cases, be navigated with kindness or without it. But let us not stay only in the bedroom. Because the Victorian honeymoon was also, genuinely and beautifully, a first taste of the world, and for a woman who had spent her entire life within a few controlled social environments, Paris in 1880 was something close to revelation. Imagine waking up in that hotel room to the sound of a city that was not London. The quality of the light was different, warmer and more diffuse, falling through windows that faced a boulevard rather than a garden. The smells that came in from the street were coffee and bread and horse traffic, and something underneath it all that was specifically Parisian, a smell that travelers in the 19th century struggled to describe accurately but universally agreed was distinct. She would dress, with the assistance of her lady's maid who had traveled with them, in one of the specially commissioned traveling costumes that formed part of her trousseau. The trousseau itself had been assembled over months, a collection of dresses, morning gowns, carriage dresses, afternoon dresses, evening dresses, walking suits, and accessories that represented an entire wardrobe for a new phase of life. The aristocratic traveler of this era was identifiable, as contemporary observers noted, by the studied restraint of her travel dress. A simple walking suit, a dark silk waist, a long coat, and a plain hat with minimal trimming. The truly well-born did not need to perform their status through extravagance. Their simplicity was the most expensive thing about them. After breakfast in the hotel dining room, which was itself a theatrical production of silver service and starched linens and waiters who moved with the synchronized grace of a practiced ensemble, they would have gone out into Paris. The Paris of 1880 was not the Paris of today, but it was recognizably itself. Haussmann's Great Modernization Project, commissioned by Napoleon III in the 1850s and 1860s, had transformed the medieval city into the ordered metropolis of wide boulevards and uniform facades that we still see today. The Champs-Élysées stretched to the Arc de Triomphe. The Louvre was there, containing one of the greatest collections of art in the world. The Opéra Garnier, that extraordinary monument to the Second Empire, had been open only since 1875. The Eiffel Tower would not be built until 1889, so the Paris skyline she would have seen was still dominated by the Dome of Les Invalides and the towers of Notre Dame and the hills of Montmartre rising in the distance. For a young woman who had spent her life in the particular world of English aristocratic society, the experience of Paris was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Familiar because she had been educated in French, because she had read French novels, because Paris had been a cultural touchstone in her social world for as long as she could remember. Foreign because nothing she had read and nothing she had been told fully prepared her for the reality of being in a city that moved at a different tempo, that organized pleasure differently, that had different relationships to public life and private behavior, and that treated married women with a degree of social visibility that English propriety tended to restrict. In Paris, a married woman of her class could walk through the Tuileries Gardens without being closely observed. She could sit in a cafe, properly accompanied, and watch the city happen around her. She could attend the opera in the company of her husband without every element of her behavior being monitored by the entire social machinery of the London season. She was still subject to the conventions of her class and her time. But the specific, relentless, exhausting observation of a young, unmarried English girl in society was over. She was a wife now. She had achieved what she had been trained to achieve. And whatever the private costs of that achievement, it also came with a kind of freedom she had not anticipated. She could buy things, not with her own money, because legally it was not precisely her own money anymore, but with the household funds and her husband's credit she could acquire. The shops of the Rue de la Paix and the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré were the finest in the world. French fashion in 1880 was at the height of its prestige. The bustle silhouette was defining the decade, that extraordinary architectural protrusion at the back of the skirt that required the skill of Paris's finest dressmakers to execute properly. Worth was the great couturier. His house dressed royalty and aristocracy from across Europe and America. A honeymoon in Paris almost inevitably involved at least a visit, and very likely a commission, at one of the ateliers along those glittering streets. She would have visited the Louvre. This was not optional for people of her education and social position. The Louvre was one of the central purposes of the continental journey, the place where the art she had been educated about in abstract could be seen in the original. The Venus de Milo had been in the Louvre since 1821. The winged victory of Samothrace since 1884 would be displayed, though it had been there since 1863 in earlier form. The great paintings, the Titians and the Veroneses and the Leonardos, were there, enormous and intimate at the same time, demanding of attention and giving back more than any reproduction could convey. For a young woman who had been educated on images in books and engravings, standing before an actual Raphael in the actual Louvre was one of those moments that simply could not be prepared for. It hit differently. It always did. And then there were the evenings. The evenings in Paris, for a couple of their social position, were their own world. Dinner in the hotel or at one of the restaurants that catered to English visitors. Places where the food was French, but the service was calibrated to British expectations. Then perhaps a visit to the opera, which was at this moment in its history one of the great temples of European cultural life. Arriving at the Opera Garnier, climbing that extraordinary staircase under the brilliant gaslight, taking their seats in a box and watching the city's most fashionable society observe each other as much as it observed the stage. The music was secondary to the spectacle, at least socially. What mattered was being seen there, dressed correctly, behaving correctly, projecting the image of a newly married aristocratic couple beginning their life together with all the visible confidence that their position required. Beneath that performance, of course, was something considerably less managed. They were still learning each other, still in the strange intermediate state of intimacy and distance that characterized the early days of a marriage between two people who barely knew each other. They had conversations now that they had never been permitted to have during the courtship. Conversations without a chaperone hovering at the edge of the room. Conversations that could last beyond the prescribed length of a morning call, that could follow unexpected threads and arrive at unexpected places. She discovered in Paris that he had a genuine interest in history. He discovered that she had opinions she had been careful not to express too forcefully during the courtship. There was something hesitant and revealing about these early conversations, the careful uncovering of who they actually were, rather than who they had been performing being. Some couples in this position found each other surprisingly. Some found each other disappointing. Some found exactly what had been negotiated, no more and no less. The historical record suggests that the quality of a Victorian aristocratic marriage depended enormously on these early weeks, that the habits established during the honeymoon, the patterns of conversation and respect and accommodation that were formed in this initial period, tended to persist. A honeymoon that began with cruelty or contempt often predicted a marriage of the same quality. A honeymoon that began with patience and curiosity had a better chance of becoming something worth calling a life together. From Paris, the journey continued. The route south through France and into Switzerland was one of the great travel experiences of the Victorian era. The railways had made the Alps accessible in a way that would have been unimaginable to the travelers of the previous century. The journey from Paris to Geneva or Lausanne, then through the mountain passes into Italy, was now a matter of days rather than weeks. But days was a relative term because the trains of 1880, while dramatically better than anything that had preceded them, were still slow by modern standards. A journey of several hundred miles might take 12 to 14 hours. You ate on the train, from hampers packed in Paris, or from the dining cars that the better lines had begun to introduce. You slept, if you could, in compartments that were comfortable but not spacious. You watched the landscape change through the windows, the rolling fields of northern France, giving way to the more dramatic terrain of Burgundy. And then, gradually, the first intimations of mountain country, the land lifting and darkening as the train climbed. She had never seen mountains before, not real mountains. The hills of the English countryside are gentle and green and deeply civilized. The Alps are something else entirely. They are not gentle. They do not pretend to be domesticated. The scale of them was something she had no referent for, no experience that could have prepared her for the moment when the train emerged from a tunnel and the window was suddenly filled with a view of peaks that rose above the clouds, with slopes of white that descended into valleys of extraordinary darkness and depth, with the whole appalling and magnificent architecture of a landscape that had been built on an entirely different scale from anything she had known. This was one of the experiences that Victorian honeymooners consistently described as transformative. Not the cities, impressive as they were, the mountains. The Alps produced in educated 19th century travelers a response that the era called the sublime, the particular mixture of awe and terror and smallness that comes from confronting something vastly larger than yourself. Romantic poets had theorized it. Painters had attempted it. But standing at the window of a train carriage as it wound through the mountain passes, with the landscape dropping away on one side into depths you could not fully comprehend, the theory became experience in a way that no amount of reading could replicate. The Swiss stops, typically Lausanne or Geneva or Montreux, offered a different tempo from Paris. Where Paris was social performance, Switzerland was rest. The great hotels of the Swiss Lake Country were famous for their quietness, their clean air, their gardens descending to the water's edge. Lake Geneva in September was an almost implausible blue. The surrounding mountains were still green at the lower elevations and beginning to gold at the tree line. The light had a quality that painters chased. The air had a quality that physicians prescribed. Wealthy British travelers had been coming to Switzerland for their health for decades, and the entire tourist infrastructure of the region had evolved in response. The hotels were excellent, the food was good. The Swiss guides were professional and reliable. If you wanted to walk in the mountains, which many Victorian tourists did, there were paths and guides and whole enterprises built around facilitating the experience. For her, Switzerland may have represented the first real pause. The first moment in the journey where no particular social performance was required, where the schedule was less rigid, where the company was simply each other and the landscape. This is where, if the historical accounts of similar journeys are any guide, some of the most important conversations of early Victorian marriages happened. Not in cities, not at dinner tables, not in the presence of others, but in the quiet spaces of a honeymoon abroad, in hotel sitting rooms after dinner with the lake visible through the window and the sound of the water and the mountains beyond. This is where two people who had been required to perform for each other might begin, tentatively and carefully, to be themselves. And then, Italy. There is a reason Italy was the destination. There is a reason it had been the destination for British aristocrats for 200 years before 1880, and the reason had not changed. Italy was where Western civilization had deposited its most extraordinary physical inheritance. Rome was where the ancient world still stood in fragments and pieces, visible and touchable, the ruins of the Forum and the Colosseum and the great baths and the churches built from stones that had been something else entirely before Christianity. Florence was where the Renaissance had happened, where the Medici had concentrated the wealth and ambition of an age into the greatest collection of painting and sculpture the world had produced in 1,000 years. Venice was something else again, something that defied category, a city built in water that had no equivalent anywhere on Earth. The aristocratic honeymoon in Italy in 1880 followed a well-established itinerary. Florence first, typically, where the obligatory visits were to the Uffizi Gallery and the Bargello and the Piazza della Signoria, where you stood before the David and the Birth of Venus, and the Botticelli paintings that you had seen only in reproductions, and where the reproductions turned out to be, as they always did, a very pale shadow of the experience of standing before the actual thing. Then Rome, where the weight of history was so present that even people who had not studied it closely felt it pressing against them. The Forum at sunset. The Pantheon, which had been standing continuously since roughly 125 AD, which had been a pagan temple and then a Christian church, and which in 1880 still functioned as one, and which remained the best preserved ancient Roman building in the world. The Vatican, with the Sistine Chapel, which visitors in 1880 could see without the crowds that make it nearly impossible to experience today. The Colosseum, massive and broken and still, despite everything, commanding. She would have stood in all of these places with a guidebook in her hands, because the Victorian age was the era that invented the modern travel guidebook. Baedeker had been publishing its famous red guides since the 1820s, and by 1880, they were comprehensive, authoritative, and universal. Every significant site in Italy was described, rated, and contextualized in the Baedeker. You walked through the Uffizi with Baedeker in hand, and it told you what to look at and what to think about it. This was not considered Philistine. It was considered properly educated behavior. The guide was the externalization of the preparation you were supposed to have done, the confirmation that you were engaging with the sites correctly. But something happens in Italy to even the most Baedeker-equipped traveler, something that the guidebook cannot fully contain. Italy in September 1880 was not the Italy of today, not overrun with the scale of mass tourism that would come in the following century. The streets were not empty, but they were not overwhelmed. Rome still had an atmosphere that distinguished travelers called melancholy, a quality of ancient light and old stone, and the specific gravity of a place that had been at the center of Western civilization for 2,000 years, and was now, in 1880, something altogether quieter and stranger. The Italian Risorgimento had only recently unified the country. Rome had been incorporated into the new Kingdom of Italy in 1870. The city was in transition, still adjusting to a role that was different from everything it had been. It was simultaneously the eternal city and a very new capital, and the tension between those two identities gave it a peculiar atmosphere that sensitive travelers found overwhelming. She would have been sensitive to it. Her education had prepared her to respond to Italy in a particular way, to see in its ruins and its art the accumulated meaning of classical antiquity that she had been educated to revere. What she would not have been prepared for was the way Italy hit her physically. The heat, even in September. The light, which was different from anything in England, harder and more insistent and somehow more honest. The smell of the streets, which were not clean by Victorian English standards. The noise, which was constant and unfiltered and alive in a way that London noise was not. The food, which was different from what she knew. The wine, which she drank for the first time without the social management of an English dinner table. The complete otherness of being somewhere that was not England, that did not operate by English rules, that did not know or care about the specific social hierarchies and anxieties that had organized her entire life. Italians, in the observation of Victorian English travelers, had a different relationship to public life and public emotion. They expressed themselves. They argued on streets. They embraced. They laughed loudly in public. They did not observe the particular English protocols of emotional containment that she had been raised to consider the mark of civilization. And if this shocked her, as it shocked many English visitors, it may also have done something else. It may have revealed for the first time that the emotional containment she had been raised to practice was not universal, not natural, not the only possible way for human beings to live. That there were places in the world where people were differently shaped, and that being exposed to that otherness was one of the things travel did to a person, whether they wanted it to or not. Venice was the final revelation, or it was often Venice. The great aristocratic tour of Italy typically concluded or reached its emotional peak in Venice, and the reason is not difficult to understand. Venice is simply unlike everywhere else. The city built on water, the canals instead of streets, the gondolas instead of carriages, the Byzantine splendor of the Basilica di San Marco, with its mosaics of gold and its 4 bronze horses stolen from Constantinople in the 13th century, its whole extraordinary surface of Eastern and Western architecture fused into something that belonged to neither tradition entirely. The Doge's palace, rising pink and white from the edge of the Grand Canal. The light on the water, which changes every hour and every season, and which painters from Canaletto to Turner had tried to capture, and which still surprised every person who encountered it for the first time, because nothing you had seen before had prepared you for its specific quality. In Venice, the journey reached something like its natural climax, not because anything dramatic happened, necessarily, but because Venice was the place where even the most controlled and proper Victorian aristocrat could feel the accumulated weight of everything the journey had been. The strangeness of marriage, the strangeness of the continent, the strangeness of freedom and constraint existing simultaneously, the strangeness of being 22 years old in a floating city at the other end of Europe, beside a man you were still learning, with the whole rest of your life arranged in front of you, like a room you had not yet entered. And then they came home. The return journey was the reversal of the departure, the same route in reverse. Venice to Florence to Rome, or directly across the northern plains to Milan, and then through the Alps, and across France, and back to Calais, and the Channel, and Dover, and the train to London. But they were not the same people who had left. This is what the honeymoon was supposed to do. This is what it was designed for, in the way that Victorian institutions were designed for things, not always consciously, but functionally. The honeymoon was the period in which 2 relative strangers were supposed to become a unit, in which the social arrangement of the marriage was supposed to begin to acquire the substance of an actual life together. Had it worked? That depended on the couple. That depended on the 1,000 individual details of temperament and expectation and kindness and patience that no social history can fully capture, because they happen between 2 specific people in private spaces, and they leave their traces only in diaries that were sometimes destroyed, and letters that were sometimes burned, and in the long subsequent arc of a marriage that might last 40 or 50 years. What we know from the historical record, broadly, is this. Victorian aristocratic marriages were not love matches in the modern sense. They were alliances. They were institutional arrangements. The emotional content that developed within them was something that grew, or didn't, within the structure that had been built for other reasons. The honeymoon was the period in which the possibility of that emotional content was either established or foreclosed. Couples who used the honeymoon well, who were curious about each other, who navigated the physical and emotional intimacies of early marriage with patience and care, frequently described their marriages in later life with something approaching real affection. Couples who did not often describe marriages of parallel lives, of courteous distance, of the kind of polite coexistence that Victorian propriety could sustain indefinitely without anyone from the outside being able to tell the difference. She came back to England a wife in every sense. She came back to a townhouse that had been readied for her and her husband, with a staff of servants who were now answerable to her as the mistress of the household, with a social calendar that was immediately and permanently different from anything she had known before. She was no longer the unmarried daughter of a baron. She was the wife of the son of an earl. Her position had changed. Her social obligations had changed. The specific freedoms and constraints of her existence had been rearranged in a configuration that would define the rest of her life. What had not changed was her. Or rather, what had not yet changed was her internal experience of who she was, underneath the new title and the new role and the new house and the new name. She was still 22. She still had opinions she had learned to be careful about expressing too forcefully. She still read history and remembered what she had read. She still had the capacity for genuine curiosity, the capacity to be genuinely moved by a painting in the Louvre or a ruin in Rome, or the specific quality of light on the Grand Canal in September. The question that the Victorian honeymoon left open, that it always left open, was what a woman was supposed to do with all of that. With the intelligence and the feeling and the education and the genuine inner life that she had been carrying quietly through all those years of preparation for a role that was not designed to use most of it. The marriage might be good, the husband might be kind, the house might be beautiful, the children, when they came, might be beloved. And still, somewhere under all of it, the question waited. What is this life, exactly? Is this all of it? Is this what the preparation was for? Some Victorian aristocratic women answered those questions by finding genuine satisfaction in the world available to them, managing great households, raising children with serious intention, engaging with the philanthropic and cultural life of their class, building real influence within the social structures that govern their world. Some found their way to the edge of those structures and pressed against them, becoming involved in the suffrage movement that was beginning to gain momentum in the 1880s, or in charitable work that brought them into contact with a reality very different from their own, or in intellectual and artistic communities that offered something that drawing rooms and dinner parties did not. And some simply lived the life they had been given, with the grace and silence that the Victorian era required, carrying their inner experience in the private language of diaries and letters, and the occasional moment, over 40 years of marriage, when a husband looked at a wife in a particular way, and something passed between them that had been accumulating since the first time. 11 weeks into an engagement, he had watched her correct his father's historical error and found, in her face, something that looked like a person worth knowing. That look, that first look, that was where it started, whatever it became. The Victorian honeymoon was not romantic in the way we understand romance. It was not free in the way we understand freedom. It was not intimate in the way we understand intimacy. It was a journey taken by two people who barely knew each other, through a Europe they had been educated to revere, under conditions of social constraint that we would find almost incomprehensible. It began with a wedding that was as much a business transaction as a love ceremony. It ended with a return to a life that was, by modern standards, profoundly unequal. And somewhere in the middle of it, in Paris and in Switzerland and in Italy, in hotel rooms and on trains and in front of paintings and under mountain skies, something was being built or not being built that would determine the quality of the next several decades of two human lives. We look back at this world from a distance that makes it easy to see only its injustices. And the injustices were real. The legal subordination of married women was real. The enforced ignorance of young brides was real. The reduction of half the human population to a single approved function was real. These were not small things. They shaped lives and limited possibilities and produced suffering that the historical record documents in diaries and letters and in the faces of photographs. Women looking back at us across a century and a half with expressions that are composed and correct and reveal almost nothing. But the historical record also contains something else. It contains evidence of genuine intelligence surviving within constraint, of genuine affection developing within arrangement, of genuine curiosity being exercised within limitation, of genuine feeling finding its way through the walls of propriety that the Victorian era built around women with such extraordinary care. She came back from her honeymoon having seen the Louvre and the Alps and the Uffizi and the Grand Canal, having tasted things she had not tasted before, having heard conversations in languages she now understood more fluently than she had when she left, having slept beside the same man for 6 weeks and begun to understand the particular landscape of his silences and his humor and his habits, having learned in ways that no one had specifically taught her what it meant to be in a body, in a marriage, in the world. She came back, in short, as someone who was in the process of becoming someone, not finished, not fully formed, not settled into the particular shape that 40 more years of Victorian wifely life would eventually produce, but in the process, still becoming, still, underneath everything, herself. That is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her. Not the titles, not the journey, not the hotels or the paintings or the mountain passes or the channel crossing. The fact that through all of it, through everything the Victorian era did to make women legible only as social functions, she remained stubbornly and quietly a person, with a history, with a mind, with an experience that was her own, and with a look that she would remember for the rest of her life, from a garden party in May, when a man who was still a stranger had watched her say something true and had recognized in her face that she was there, that she had always been there. That was where the honeymoon actually began, not on the train, not in Paris, there, in that garden, in that moment of recognition between two people who were still, to each other, almost entirely unknown. Everything else was the journey toward finding out if that recognition had been real,